Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine. Brought up in a trilingual household in New York, Nicole Rolet worked in banking and international relations before she set up Chêne Bleu in the southern Rhône Valley with her husband Xavier. Our wide-ranging chat covered everything from ley lines to the pursuit of legacy, Grenache's underdog status to the future of fine wine. Listen to Nicole tell us why she doesn't do woo-woo and why she's always marched to her own drummer. Hello, Nicole, and welcome to the podcast.
Tim, it's an absolute pleasure to see you.
Likewise, and to hear your voice. And you're in France, I know, but I think you're in Paris, aren't you?
Absolutely. I had to come up today for an event with Figaro Vin, so I'm actually in their headquarters right now.
Figaro Vin, that sounds very posh. What is it, like a wine club?
It's the wine division of the Figaro magazine.
And are you doing a tasting?
We were doing a very intensive 1-minute video series. This was on Le Rosé, and you have to give very short soundbite answers. And it's very fast paced. So it's quite amusing to now do a podcast and go to the director's cut instead of the trailer.
Exactly. Listen, your background is really interesting. You're a classic citizen of the world in a way. You sort of French, Italian, and American, I think, are your roots. Just tell us a little bit about where you were brought up and about your parents. And also this amazing grandmother of yours who was a Boston suffragette, wasn't she?
Absolutely. I'm very proud of her. I also spent time in Brazil. My family had traveled a lot and they were multicultural and multilingual. So I had the great gift of growing up in a household where 3 languages were spoken pretty much every single day. And we switched around a lot, which was helpful because then by the time I was 10, I had already picked them up myself, English, French, and Italian. And that made a very good basis for adding other languages. So I've studied quite a few in my life, about 8. So this was a huge silver ladle of sociocultural privilege that in fact did set me up for a lot of travel and a lot of connection to people around the world because I became extremely interested in different cultures and languages. And my father was self-made, self-taught. He had become a wine expert and had risen up from the mailroom to being the CEO of Pirelli Tires. My mother was a food critic, a bit like a Julia Child. She had found herself in Paris in the 50s and brought a lot of that sophisticated know-how to the US. And we got to spend our life going to Michelin-starred restaurants and all that good stuff for free.
Which was on somebody else's time, right?
That's right. We didn't have a lot of money, but we certainly had access to great food and wine, a bit like Masters of Wine, right? We
exactly.
Get to drink the best wines of the world and not have to pay for them.
Afford them. Yeah. What about the grandmother, the Boston suffragette? Was that on your mum's side or your dad's side?
That was on my mother's side. All the women in my family were career women. They married late and they all went on to change the world in various ways. And so there was a lot of family obligation to feel that you were doing your part in that sense. And when I arrived in the wine world, there were already a lot of women doing wonderful things and making wonderful wines. But I think I did find a relatively remote corner of France where that wasn't yet the norm. So I'm trying in my own little way to change some hearts and minds.
We'll hear about that in a minute. So you were brought up with wine and food around you, basically, yeah, because of both your parents, yeah. Did you ever imagine you'd end up in wine?
Absolutely not. Never, under any circumstance, did the thought even begin to cross my mind. I was really thinking about international relations and other things, and I thought that my multicultural background would be best put to use in a completely different environment. In fact, Pauline Vicard, who's the principal of the Irene Global Institute for the Future of Fine Wine that you know, she pointed out that in wine as well, you see a certain citizen of the world mindset that's coming up now, with the Place de Bordeaux opening up to the best and the brightest, and this inference that there's a certain set of benchmarks, and if you qualify for that, you're part of this sort of global wine elite, right? Which is a little bit severed from its birthplace and part of a diaspora of wines that are collected by the same kinds of people all over the world, traded, all sorts of things. Not that we're necessarily part of that, but it's just an interesting parallel that arose when you asked me about being a citizen of the world. I think there's this new trend that's happening a little bit.
Wine is, to be interested in wine is to be a citizen of the world. What did you study at college, at university, and what did you do once you graduated? Did you go into international relations? Did you go into finance? You've done so many things. So
I was extremely pushed towards using all that background that I had in professions like international relations. So that's what I studied. I plan to be a diplomat, and I'm also a nerd, right? I love history, geography, books, culture. So think tanks were perfect. I got to study all day and get paid for it. The biggest shock was transitioning to the trading floor at Merrill Lynch, because I'd become a bit of a Latin American specialist in a think tank with David Rockefeller, and all the banks were hiring like crazy. So they needed people who had that background. And I was thrust onto the largest trading floor in the world of the time, 350 people in one giant room, buy, sell, all that stuff like you see in the movies. And it was the opposite of the quiet, thoughtful environment of the think tank. It was all action-packed, adrenaline, fast-paced, etc. I actually developed adrenaline addiction, which was quite an interesting phenomenon. um,
coffee wasn't
took
enough, right?
took me a while to rid myself of that, but there's nothing like a ninth century vineyard to leach it out of you.
Yeah, I mean, I've read you describe yourself as pathologically shy, and I think for anyone who knows you, it seems hard to believe. I mean, you're so gregarious and fun. Is it something you've got better at dealing with over the years, and was that just as a kid you were shy?
Kind of you to ask. Definitely something that might surprise someone who meets me, because I was always very scared of people. I was curious and excited about them, but I was hypersensitive, hyper empathetic, very thin skinned, bit like that Pinot grape that we saw in that movie Sideways, not hearty like a Grenache. And the divorce of my parents had a big effect on me, and I just eventually realized that if you're shy, life sort of passes you by, and you never get to make stuff happen and get the opportunities that you'd like to have. So I just went on this quest to free myself from all that uh, baggage, and try to force myself to learn how to be part of the world. And I guess it's a bit like
Well,
Forrest
you
Gump,
succeeded.
you learn to walk finally, and then you just keep running and you never look back. So you fake it till you make it, right? I'm also an
Yeah.
Aquarius, which don't know anything about that stuff actually, so I don't want to go out of my depth here, but I know that we're very community oriented. We like to share and connect, and I think it's a great way to get over your sacred wounds, right? We all come out of childhood with those,
Yeah.
and it's important as adults to find ways to create the lives that we want, and not be carrying around that big baggage that gets in the way of who we want to be when we grow up.
I think that's very true. I mean, you're one half of this sort of power couple, really, that your husband, Xavier Rolet, many people know he ran the London Stock Exchange, is just another kind of amazing figure in finance. How did you meet? And was wine part of the meeting of minds, as it were?
Xavier. Oh, my Xavier. So actually, on the face of it, we couldn't be more different, right? If we met in a funny way, we'd be here all day if I told you the story, but neither of us remember meeting the way we actually did meet. Ironically, we found out 10 years after being married that we had both met at some party that neither of us remembered. There was an incriminating photo of us both together chatting. So we we had finally agreed to disagree, only to find out we were both wrong. But more importantly, when you'd see us in a together in a room, you'd think, what? He's nature boy. I'm city girl. He loved plants and animals. I love people, parties, all of that. And he's very private and very open. And he's very brilliant. And I am not. I compensate for talent with enthusiasm and hard work. So we are we have very different superpowers
You're being very
and
modest.
very
Be
different
very,
super
very modest.
shortcomings. So actually, when you get to know us, I think we certainly feel that we connect deeply on values, loyalty, sense of duty, sense of purpose, work ethic, commitment to
Yeah.
family, all these very deep things that don't always meet the eye when you look at the social mannerisms. But love of wine was not on that list. Now it is. When we started, I fell in love with him
Exactly. I hope
despite the
so.
wine,
Yeah.
not because of it. On our first real date, he told me about this crazy project that he had just committed to in France, and he was all excited about the extraordinary terroir, and he had discovered this hidden gem, and it was far away from everything and everyone, and he was going to turn it into all this exciting stuff, and here was why. And I looked at him with big round eyes. He was so exciting to be with him up until that point. And he had these amazing daughters that he told me all about, who turned out to be incredible and changed my life. And it was all great. And then this suddenly this big project. And I remember thinking, like, why is he even here on this date with me? Why isn't he taking out some little vigneron daughter of somebody with a famous domain who's going to show him how to get it all done?
Gonna help
Exactly.
him. Yeah. And
So
that
that
was La
was La
Verrière, right?
Verrière,
Which is where Chêne Bleu
absolutely.
is. And he bought it, I think, in
Yep,
1993.
he
Yeah.
founded in 93, bought it in 94. That's right.
So just tell us a little bit about where it is and what makes it special, because it's a very special place. I'm lucky enough to have been there.
I really, really am grateful to you for having taken the time to make it all the way up that little winding road to the heart of this forest, wondering 12 times if you're on the right road or if your car is going to break down. What will you do? And will they find your bones on the side of the road? It's so wild up there, and it's in the upper reaches of the Vaucluse, in the Ventoux, loosely defined, because we're in fact on top of four appellations. So in wine terms, we're in part on the AOC Ventoux, but we are very much marching to our own drummer up there, and it's full of rich history. But it's a history of hardworking people. It was a priory. All those Templars had belief systems that there were energy fields where there's this cosmic celestial energy coming down, and this what they call telluric energy coming up into these energetic superhighways. So these places are charged with history and with all sorts of local sacred beliefs that they are always considered very special because they had a convergence of things that used to be very important in
And
spiritual
and
times.
it feels it, I think. I mean, I hesitate to use the word energy, but I think there is an energy
Yeah, I
about the
think
place.
it is, right? There's actually, yeah, there's a funny story because I come at it from, I'm from New York. I don't do woo woo, okay? And yet, it's very special there because you're on the edge of a tectonic plate. Of course, they didn't know anything about that, and the world was flat, and they thought there were these energetic superhighways and all this stuff. But nowadays, there are people connecting a lot of that geological energy stuff, which you can actually measure with those little instruments, like you can the Faradic cage effects, etc. And then these more spiritual beliefs, because they've managed to trace all sorts of temples to places around the world with these uh, on these ley lines, right, of tectonic energy.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the altitude is very defining there. The fact that we're at 550 meters, which is, of course, extremely high in wine terms for that region. It gives this special situation with snow when the others have rain in the valley, harvest 4 to 5 weeks later than our neighbors. So used to be starting at the beginning of October. Now we're sometime in September, but we're still uh, in a completely out of sync situation. But we have a much slower growing season, which, of course, as you know, in a hot climate is a very helpful thing to bring out complexity
It's
and all
good.
sorts
Yeah.
of flavors. So Xavier, who had a lot of winemaking on his cousin's side. He was from a military family, but his cousins were the Rolet and the Jura, and he was the one who founded and suspected that it had this incredible
And
terroir.
it was,
So it's 100% to his
yeah,
credit.
it was in his blood. I mean, you very, very bravely shared details of your first date with us, but you have to. How did he persuade you to become the CEO of Chêne Bleu, of this new project? I mean, you went off. You went and studied at Davis in the California, didn't you? You did WSET. I mean, so he must have said something that persuaded you to
It's a
do
bit
it.
the same principle as a lobster. You put them in the cold water and then you slowly turn up the heat, and before you know it, they're cooked. And so for me, it was an issue because I guess I was the least likely person to be involved. In fact, to be very honest, I was going to say off the record, but this is hardly off the record. But I will admit that I thought it was a very bad idea. And his sister Benedict and her husband Jean Louis had joined us on the project, and the four of us were trying to do this restoration. And I kept hearing them talk about the potential and these people who were telling us it was going to be so special because the terroir, blah blah blah. And I was like, yeah, over my dead body. I mean, you think you're just going to rock up and find some hidden gem that a bunch of French people who all know so much more about wine than all of us put together are going to, have overlooked? Of course, I was very myopic at the time. I didn't know about my wine history and the fact that these very prized terroirs had been very much abandoned with the arrival of chemicals, mechanization, cooperatives at the second half of the 20th century. They had just kind of dumped all these high maintenance uh, vineyards, and there was about to be a whole turnaround where, of course, now everybody's moving up the mountain to find little protected terroirs like ours. But I didn't know enough then. I also didn't know enough to not to ever take a bet against Xavier on anything like that. He's always 25 years ahead of the rest of us. I learned my lesson.
Because he's determined. Isn't he? Where did you start? In the vineyard, the cellar, a bit of both. I mean, it took you how long was it? It was like 10 years to produce wine,
Yeah,
didn't
so yes, absolutely. So what happened is he pushed me to take my first serious wine course. I had just been to those fun wine evenings where you have, let's call it edutainment, somebody very knowledgeable, a good raconteur who gives you some fun anecdotes, etc., and convinces you to buy whatever they're pouring. And he got me to the WSET, and that was really transformational for me. It got me on this whole journey. I loved it.
That's the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, for anybody listening who doesn't know that, but
Yeah,
most
the
people
Wine and
will. But
Spirits
yeah,
Education Trust. I
yeah,
think everybody should put
yeah.
themselves through at least through the 3-day level 2 if they're going to be serious about navigating independently around the wine world. It's such a great way to get going. And I guess that really got me excited. But what really changed my life was that I guess behind the scenes, my mother dying. I think anyone who's been through that experience, you become very preoccupied with the transience of things, the pursuit of purpose, legacy, all those things that change the yardstick on you overnight in many cases. And I threw myself into this project because it suddenly seemed to be such a great anecdote against the proverbial sic transit gloria mundi, all that full
Mm,
of sound and fury and
yeah.
signifying
Well,
nothing.
creating something that will last, creating something that will
It was
survive
the
you.
only
And
thing that I could think of that was not going to be washed away from time. I mean, don't forget, I don't have the talents to write the next Shakespeare novel or find the cure for cancer, all that stuff. So, it was like, well, what can I do that's actually going to stay when I'm gone? And wait a minute, if I put my little brick into this long lineage of this place that's been around for more than 1,000 years, then that's good enough for me. I will have done my job in my time on this earth. So I
I,
became a
I
complete
love that idea.
workaholic on the back of that. And there's nothing like
And
work
it
to
works, right?
also not think about pain. And, and I think there was a really big shift after that. So,
And how many hectares do you have now planted?
we are on 30 hectares. And for me, it was, I think, very easy to think about all the grapes that you could do plant there, because no one
Mm.
had actually really explored the potential of the altitude and really thought through what you could do there. It was a bit of a knee jerk.
So you replanted everything, did you? You had to replant from scratch.
Everything was a mess. We didn't replant, but we took it took us about 12 years just to restructure the vineyard. The vines had been in fermage, but then, rethinking the altitude, the isolation, the soils, and deconstructing what was there, retrellising everything, taking out truckloads of stones that are, backbreaking work, because that vineyard vomits rocks, because it's, the Mont Ventoux right under the surface of the soil. There's that really hard rock, and we have such a complexity of minerals there with
Yeah.
the Jurassic, Triassic, Cretaceous, and that's really sort of putting those front and center as the kind of mineral signature of the wine, along with this natural acidity that we have that opens the door to wines that can age very well.
Because of the
Yeah, so
altitude,
that
yeah.
was all very interesting. At this point, I was completely hooked. Of course, making wine and running a winery are different skill sets. And I think transitioning to being a CEO was a whole other set of challenges. I mean, I'm a pleaser by nature, right? I like to make people happy. I like their approval. And I loved being part of these kind of four musketeers from that earlier phase and the management by committee.
With the
And
family, yeah.
when my brother-in-law and sister-in-law retired, uh, we went into more classic organization. I was, of course, super, super lucky that the amazing Marlène Angelos came to join me. You may know her as the director of the International Grenache Association. We had worked together for several years.
Mm.
She had gone to Suze and she was just fabulous. And the fact that she was willing to come along as my deputy CEO and take that on has been a
That helps,
godsend.
yeah.
But apart from the learning curve, I think it's certainly put me up against the fact that you when you lead, you can't always please everyone. And especially a bunch of French
Mm.
people with, you're thrust into the deep end of the pool with
Especially.
the cultural issues of the French versus the Anglo-Saxon work culture, all of that stuff. So I'm doing my best there to bridge the gap. And she's,
Listen,
yeah.
tell me about the vineyards, because I think you're organic, biodynamic, and you're very hot on sustainability as well. Was that the plan from the start?
So, absolutely, in the sense that my husband is always so many years ahead of the curve on all this stuff. And remember, 30 years ago when he found this thing, it was the absolute height in the belief of petrochemically based viticulture,
Mm.
that super extracted, the oaky reds, Châteauneuf-du-Pape getting 100 points, all of that. Remember people driving around downtown Châteauneuf in their quote unquote Bob mobiles, that had license plates that say, THX
Bob, as
BOB,
in Robert Parker. Robert Parker.
and to be fair, many of the critics in those days were all rah-rah about that particular style. And for Xavier to show up and be completely in the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of focusing on nature and freshness and
Mm.
biodiversity, long before sustainability was a hashtag, that is, I think, very important, because to some extent,
That
right,
was
and a
your
wine
focus,
estate
yeah?
that's been around
Mm.
for 1,100 years, certainly I'd like to think
Mm.
qualifies as sustainable. um, and I know a lot of people now are
It's still
trumpeting
there.
themselves as being the first regenerative vineyard, et cetera. But I think I'd argue that this is the ultimate case study in regeneration. And so we're really very focused on that in everything we do now. There's even been a case study at Harvard Business School about Chêne Bleu, and the fact that it covers several things, but this idea that um, if you really dial back all of that and really go back to just listening and learning and watching, you can do so much with so little in terms of all the interventions in the vineyard. I'd say that our
Just from good
exactly
grapes.
good
Good
grapes,
grapes. Yeah.
spend your money on that. In the winery, we are not really, as you know, in the natural wine camp. I think a lot of discipline and structure and thought and care in the winery is much more in keeping with the Chêne Bleu style, and the ability to make wines that have structure, balance, capacity to age, etc. But in the vineyard, it's all about nature.
I mean, you said you got 30 hectares. I just wonder how much of that is Grenache. I mean, Grenache is kind of your focus, isn't it? You love Grenache. And that's how I met you, really, was at
Exactly.
a Grenache
I am
conference.
very
So.
raw at Grenache. You're so right. Actually, ironically, we have less Grenache than we have Syrah. We also have some Mourvèdre, Cinsault, Clairette, Viognier, Roussanne, Marsanne, Rolle, all of the more northern Rhône bias, especially on the whites because of that altitude and the mineral soils, and that acidity, the freshness that we talked about. But Grenache was important to me because it's always been sort of the underdog of the wine world. If you have so many other grapes, if you ask a consumer what are what are the grapes that come to mind, especially the red grapes, Grenache will usually not be towards the top of their list, and yet we believe that it was this unsung hero and it deserved a seat at the table of the Olympus of grapes. And so, thanks in large part to you and the
You're
people who
right.
came, we really were able to get a much clearer sense of what's the USP of that grape, right? Perfect food partner.
And is Grenache back in fashion, do you think? Because there was a period when lots of people were pulling it out in the southern Rhone, but also in Spain. I mean, thousands of hectares pulled out
Yes,
in Spain.
thousands,
Tens of
absolutely. Well, I
thousands, I mean,
think there are
yeah.
many reasons why Grenache is enjoying a big moment. And of course, the Pinot is very much in fashion, and they always say that Grenache is the Pinot of the South. But if Pinot is silk, Grenache is velvet, that kind of thing. But you know that it's also better when it's cheaper. A cheap Grenache will always be better than a cheap Pinot. And on the expensive side, the finest will still be cheaper than a fine Pinot. So there's good value for money there. And I think like Pinot, these are grapes that you graduate to, right? When you're just starting out, you're very happy to have a certain grape type like a Cabernet or a Syrah that is easier to identify no matter where it's from or who's made it. Whereas as you get more into wine and you like to connect flavor and style to terroir, Grenache is so good at transmitting that sense of place that it's really interesting and kaleidoscopic. So the good news is it's leapfrogged to fifth position from 12th when we did the Grenache
Yeah, well, that's good.
Symposium. So we're very happy about that.
Really?
And in
Oh,
Napa,
that's good,
people are
isn't it?
tearing up their Cabernets to plant Grenache in a number of cases, which is really
That's
surprising.
that's
Yeah,
good
that's
news,
big
I think.
news.
I mean, it's a grape that works very well in a blend. I mean, you've mentioned Syrah Mourvèdre, which is the classic blend. I mean, Chateauneuf can have 13 or is it 14 varieties if you count Grenache twice, I think. But it also works on its own. I mean, some fantastic examples of standalone Grenaches, and that's one of its
It
USPs, isn't it?
is, and I'd like to think that you can trace that trend very much to, at least in the kind of quote unquote old world, to the time of the Grenache Symposium, because since then a lot of Grenachista winemakers have come out of the closet, are making 100% cuvées of Grenache, and there's that Grenache pride now where people like to put it on the front of the label and not just in the fine print on the back. I like that aspect a lot because I think it really does credit to the fact that it's a grape. It's very approachable, not just for a consumer but also for a winemaker, because they can make it their own and they can put their mark on it, and they can really choose to make a style that is in keeping with their terroir. If you have a soft translucent Grenache, maybe you're going to stay away from oak because it can easily be overwhelmed. But if you have a hardy, dense, muscular Grenache like the one we get at altitude, with thick skins packed with complex phenolics, etc., then you can really work the oak and make something with great aging potential. So from a winemaker's point of view, it's lovely to have a grape that can both be ensemble player or supporting cast as it traditionally was with the alpha grapes, or also stand on its own.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk to you a little bit about something called the Extreme Wine Course, because it's one of the things you run from La Verrière, which, as well as being the home of Chêne Bleu, of course, is also a luxury guest house, right? And you run this Extreme Wine Course. Now, what makes it extreme? I mean, do you get them up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and is it kind of cold showers and 10-mile jogs or
It
hikes or
is
something? Or what? How does
extreme
it
on
work?
many levels, including for the people who have to organize it and run it, which is why I just finished that. And I'm glad this is a podcast and you don't see the big circles under my eyes. But
Oh, you look great.
the infamous extreme wine course is not for the faint of heart. It's designed for that small percentage of wine enthusiasts who are not content with just randomly wandering around the wine world and learning bits and bobs here and there, or not even, and just having a sort of hodgepodge of wine knowledge. They're curious to develop that referencing system that professional wine people have, where they know their regions, they know their grape types, they don't have these big blind spots as consumers tend to acquire. They get familiar with this region or that region because their uncle blah blah blah, or they visited this region with whoever, or and this way they can round out all the things they're interested in. But what's fun about it, it's taught by Clive Barlow, who's chairman of education at the Institute of Master of Wine for a number of years and all that stuff.
Lovely
So
guy.
I know
Yeah.
you and he are great friends, and he thinks the world of you
Yeah.
as I do.
Yeah.
And Clive
Yeah.
is fantastic in that he's not just super knowledgeable as you'd expect from a master of wine, but also truly dedicated to watching the progress of the students. He's a vocationally a great instructor, and
He's he's a very
yeah,
good
he loves
teacher, isn't
that,
he?
and
Yeah.
no question is too big or too small, so we can accommodate anyone from beginner, intermediate, advanced. The characteristic that they have in common is that kind of bring it on. I want to hear, I want to learn as much as
Bring it on,
possible.
man.
I want to come at this material from every which way. I want the food and wine pairing. I
I
want
like it.
all these. I want to understand vineyard work. I want to understand winery, and
It's it's
so it's, yeah,
hardcore, right?
it's a
Yeah,
souped up
hardcore,
WSET level
total
2 or level
immersion.
3, where we add a lot of the stuff that's really relevant for consumers who want to buy fine wine.
Yeah.
And the greatest compliment was some doctor who was not a spring chicken, and he wrote to us that it was the best life experience that he had had since his honeymoon in 1976.
That sounds good. Uh, I mean, as if you haven't got enough on your plate, you're also the person behind Fine Minds for Fine Wines, and you chair, as you mentioned earlier, with Pauline Vicard, who works for you, the Irene Global Institute. Just tell us briefly what those two things do as
Well,
well.
that kind of happened organically, no pun intended, around the time of the 10th anniversary of our first cuvee. And I was trying to figure out the best thing to do. Everybody usually has just a big party, and I wanted to thank some of the people who had helped us with the heavy lifting. And there were things going on in my life. I didn't want a huge shebang. Then I decided to try to do something in keeping with this idea that Chêne Bleu has always been sort of the thinking person's wine. We have there are a lot of dimensions there. If you just want something very straightforward, then probably don't spend your time trying to understand why our little vineyard is such a little outlier and why there's so much going on there. But the idea was, wait a minute, if we want to be relevant to the fine wine world 10 years from now, we need to try to figure out where that fine wine world will be. And of course, at the rate we're going, it's so many variables, right? Everybody's rocked by the speed of change. How do you how do you deconstruct that? How do you try to take a stab at where the wine world is going? So I thought, oh well, there must be a think tank out there that spends all its time thinking about that, because that's what think tanks do.
There
And
wasn't.
the surprise, the surprise was that the wine world has these fabulous institutions, starting with the Institute of Masters of Wine, but they all have very different remits, and nobody was sort of feeling responsible for having an impartial forum to think about this stuff, and to do this
And that
kind of
was you.
future
Yeah.
proofing. So
Yeah.
I thought about it, and I thought, okay, well, we need to figure out the big levers that are likely to determine that future. So of course, fine wine will always have stuff in common with all wine, regulation, weather, all sorts of things. But it also is very much conditioned by the future of geopolitics, the future of finance, who's going to buy that wine, right? Tech, and not to mention culture, art, society, auction houses.
Marketing,
You should
image, longevity,
exactly
yeah.
right. The future of luxury, the future of gastronomy, and of course now more and more ecology and climate. Where are those going? And so the idea was to create a bit of a hologram around fine wine to think to talk to experts in all those fields and say, okay, if we put all of that back together, what address should we put in the GPS for fine wine? And who wants to collaborate with us formally or informally in contributing their ideas towards where they think fine wine should be headed?
Mhm.
And I know you've been a great advocate for thinking about those things. And it's really important to have people like you who have the depth of thinking and the breadth of knowledge to be working with us on
We-
putting those ideas
Yeah,
together.
and I think a lot of what excites me really is that the fine wine world is so much more diverse than it was even 10 years ago. The idea that fine wine can come from South Africa or from Greece or I don't know, Moldova, anywhere, frankly, is exciting, I think, but for consumers, but also for those of us writing about it or selling it. But the other thing I wanted to ask, because you're currently studying again, I can't believe you have enough hours in the day. You're currently studying at Harvard.
I don't. That's the short answer.
What are you studying, and how is that related to Chêne Bleu? What you're doing there?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting because it kind of ties back to the question you just asked about the future of fine wine. I think all we're all consciously or unconsciously beginning to wrap our heads around this idea that climate, which was one of the areas on the what they call the polycrisis map of the world right now, is actually in the wine world in particular, as a front runner, but everyone else catching up very quickly, the most defining thing of our time. And one by one we're sort of getting to that realization in our own ways, in our own time. And I think the the definition of, because winemakers, all winemakers, not just fine winemakers, of course, are affected by climate, but already before climate change, climate was so inherently part of the narrative of fine wine. We were already all obsessed about every nuance that happened on every vintage, right? And so if you put in there the fact that viticulture is the most leveraged crop to climate change, and the fact that climate change is becoming a completely newly defining part of our existence. I've seen one by one all the smartest people I know go from thinking, okay, climate change is important, but I'm I have to dedicate myself to X, Y, and Z for whatever reasons that are more urgent or more important to me. And so let's say you are like the painting in Magritte where you see the guy with the big apple. Like, there was this big apple over here, and most of the people we talk to are not denying that there's a giant apple there being climate. And now I've watched a bit like with the eclipse we just had, this apple coming right in this center of their field of vision as they start to connect climate in particular to agriculture, and within agriculture viticulture, because
And that's
they're
what you're
making more
studying,
and
is
more.
it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're making, there's more and more connections about how the type of agriculture that you embrace is directly having a leveraged impact on climate change in ways that we never fully understood before. And many people were talking about climate in the context of carbon. And our work at Harvard has been about regenerative agriculture and viticulture, but quickly we found ourselves in the last 4 or 5 months learning more about how agriculture is actually much bigger. It was not if you just look at carbon, we're talking about maybe 20% of the problem, but unfortunately, carbon is only a piece of it. And now these issues of biodiversity loss and forever chemicals going from agriculture and viticulture into the oceans, killing the surface of plankton, which is, of course, the one that was deflecting the UV rays. And now that's causing an acceleration of the heating of the ocean that nobody really had in their original forecasts. And that water vapor is a huge part of climate change in ways that wasn't really understood even 2-3 years ago. And with all of that,
We could always do a podcast just on that.
I'm sorry?
We could always do a podcast just on that. I mean, it's such a huge...
Right. So when you ask me what we're doing at Harvard, we're trying to get access to all the latest and greatest on climate, although, greatest is more like very depressing rather, but to use
don't want to
that
read it in too much depth.
Try to connect it in with where viticulture should be heading, why and how.
Final question, because I know you do get away from wine sometimes, but you have this incredibly busy life, high-powered, dynamic, you never seem to stop. But
oh, yes.
how do you relax? How
Tim,
do you get away
so
from
glamorous.
It?
If you only knew what it's like in the kitchen. It's like ratatouille, It's like knives and pots and pans flying every which way. It's a zoo back there.
Come on, Nicole, what are you reading at the moment? How do you relax? How do you get away from it?
Okay, listen, no time to relax and let alone sleep. I'd say thank God every morning that there's coffee and concealer, breakfast of champions. And I don't know how I'd make it through my day without them. There are never enough hours in the day. And I think that when you run a vineyard and you feel responsible for not just the vines, but the people and everything that comes with it, you never have peace of mind. A bit like with children, you never know. They can be on the other side of the world, and the cliches about you're never happier than your most unhappy child. So I think that applies as well to vineyard problems. So no, there's if you know a way to get more time to get stuff done, I'm a taker.
You're all ears.
So,
Listen, Nicole, it's been an amazing talking to you. I mean, what an incredible career you've had. I'm so glad that you went into wine and didn't stay with the think tank or on Wall Street or something like that, because everything you've done for wine has just been so valuable. And what you're still doing is amazing. So thanks for being you. And I'll see you very soon. I hope I'm going to catch up with you in London for dinner soon.
Yes, Tim. And just a huge thank you to you. You're way too kind. This is way too flattering. I don't deserve half of that praise at all. But most importantly, I've always looked up to you. I'll never forget when I was a complete rookie, straight out of my WCT level 2, green behind the ears, and when we had won that gold medal for Viognier at the London International Wine Fair, and you were so kind to grace me with your presence, and I took a picture of you. I could have not of us together. I felt like I was just I've always really looked up to you and what you do for the wine world, and the fact that we have people who not just know a lot about wine, but like you are willing to take responsibility for thinking about it from every different point of view is something absolutely necessary to ensure our collective future. So thank you so much.
Thank you. You've made my day. When does Nicole sleep? What an amazing visionary and high achiever she is. And those Chêne Bleu wines really are special. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Vicente Cebrián from Marques de Murieta and Pazo de Barrantes in Spain. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.